Ethan Carter returned to a farm gate that no longer seemed to acknowledge him. The moment his truck idled to a halt on the gravel, two dark sport utility vehicles materialized, blocking the lane, their headlights piercing the muted gray of the autumn morning. A woman, clad in a somber uniform, emerged, clutching a laminated document as if it were a symbol of authority, and stated with unvarnished finality that he was forbidden from setting foot on the property. Ethan let out a disbelieving laugh, convinced this was a bureaucratic blunder, a misplaced decree aimed at the wrong individual. Then a second woman appeared, older, with an air of composed authority that hinted at an unshakable self-belief, and informed him that, as of that very month, the Carter farm was now under the purview of the Homeowners Association. Within mere hours, she would discover the true ownership of the land she had so brazenly attempted to claim. The journey had spanned 8 hours, predominantly traversing flat highways bordered by dwindling woodlands, the kind of drive that compelled introspection, whether one willed it or not. Ethan had departed the oil fields the instant the call arrived, the doctor's voice measured yet urgent, explaining his father had experienced a cardiac event and was currently stable but frail. He hadn't anticipated returning to Millbrook County this year, or perhaps ever, if he were being entirely candid, as departure had always felt more attainable than remaining. Yet, familial bonds proved stronger than geographic divides, and somewhere around the 4th hour of his drive, his thoughts coalesced solely on reaching his father's bedside. The farm itself had been a Carter legacy for over 70 years, encompassing 300 acres of pasture, timber, and rich red clay soil that his grandfather had painstakingly cleared by hand before the war. Ethan's childhood was filled with chasing barn cats through the hayloft, mastering the tractor before a car, and observing his father meticulously mend fences in the soft, coppery glow of early mornings. He recalled the farm's scent with particular clarity: damp hay, diesel fuel, and the unique sweetness of freshly cut grass in June. For 12 years, he had cultivated a career far removed from these roots, reassuring himself that the land would always be there upon his return. His grandfather, a figure Ethan knew only through faded photographs and his father's dinner-time anecdotes, had acquired the initial parcel for less than $2,000, working triple shifts across 2 counties to amass the down payment. He constructed the first barn from salvaged lumber from a demolished mill and personally dug the well the summer before Richard was born, determined that no Carter would ever be beholden to an external water source. Richard had judiciously expanded the farm over 4 decades, acquiring adjacent plots as neighboring families divested smaller holdings, always prioritizing the land's integrity over ease of management, thereby preserving its profound significance. Ethan had absorbed these narratives like a child absorbs formative tales, only now fully grasping their immense weight. He had envisioned a quiet reunion, a few days by his father's side, a discussion about securing assistance for the upcoming winter, perhaps a stroll to the old cattle pond where he'd fished as a boy. He had not anticipated a barricade. He had not imagined strangers in matching jackets positioned between him and the only home he had ever truly known, their arms crossed, their expressions carefully schooled into a practiced indifference, as if barring a man from his ancestral land were merely another duty on a job description. The woman who approached his window identified herself as Linda Brooks, the head of the Homeowners Association's security detail, and stated that his name was on a list. Not a roster of residents, nor a directory of members, but a blacklist of individuals prohibited from entering. Ethan requested to see the official documentation. Linda, holding up the laminated sheet once more as if its mere repetition lent it validity, reiterated that his name had been flagged and that he needed to turn his truck around immediately. Ethan remained seated for a considerable pause, his hands resting on the steering wheel, scrutinizing her face for any indication that this was a jest, a subtle shift that might dispel the palpable tension. There was none. The sky behind her had assumed the somber hue of wet slate, and beyond the checkpoint, he could discern the familiar silhouette of the old barn roof, its patches of tin unmistakably his father's handiwork from years past. He met Linda's gaze and uttered the only rational statement that occurred to him in that moment. His name was inscribed on the deed to this land long before her association had even been named. It was then that a second vehicle arrived, and a woman emerged who moved with the unmistakable self-assurance of someone who owned the very ground beneath her feet. Victoria Hale didn't so much introduce herself as announce her presence. The precise, deliberate click of her sedan door closing underscored her arrival. Her heels found solid purchase on the gravel with an assured stride. At 52 years of age, she carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to unquestioning compliance. She proceeded directly toward Ethan's truck, radiating an unhurried confidence, the kind that comes from never having contemplated the possibility of error. She informed him, without preamble, that the Homeowners Association had assumed stewardship of the surrounding properties, including what she termed the former Carter parcel. Furthermore, she declared that his father, Richard Carter, was no longer deemed capable of overseeing the land. A chill settled in Ethan's chest. Not precisely fear, but the peculiar stillness that precedes a decision to confront. Victoria continued to articulate her rationale, as though reciting from a rehearsed script. She asserted that Ethan had been absent from the community for over a decade. She claimed his father's health had deteriorated to a point of incompetence, in her estimation, and that, for the welfare of the neighborhood, the association felt compelled to intervene and assume control. She delivered these pronouncements with the practiced composure of someone unaccustomed to opposition. Then she uttered the sentence that would become a recurring motif throughout the year, a statement Sheriff Mason Cole would later read aloud in a courtroom with the flat, damning intonation of someone quoting evidence. She warned Ethan that if he attempted to pass the gate, he would be apprehended for trespassing on association property. Ethan's voice remained level. He did not reach for his phone. Not yet. He simply inquired, with the same placid tone she had employed, about the specific legal instrument that granted the Homeowners Association jurisdiction over 300 acres that had belonged to his family prior to her organization's very existence. Victoria presented a single sheet of paper. It was an internal association notice, bearing a letterhead and a signature, nothing more. There was no deed, no transfer of title, no court order, no county recording, nothing that would withstand even cursory legal examination. Ethan studied the document, then looked back at her, and something in his expression must have unsettled her, for a faint flicker, like a light bulb momentarily sputtering before steadying, crossed her composure for the first time. He stated calmly that a notice printed on association letterhead did not alter the ownership of the ground she stood upon. Victoria's lips tightened, forming a line that was both a smile and a warning. She declared the matter settled, that the board had already voted, and that any resistance would only complicate matters for him and his father. With a decisive turn, she rejoined her vehicle, leaving Linda and the security detail at the gate, and Ethan seated in his truck on the incorrect side of a checkpoint that lacked any legitimate legal standing. He offered no further argument. Instead, he smoothly reversed his truck, located a secluded route he recalled from childhood fishing excursions, and proceeded directly to the hospital, a growing conviction solidifying within him that whatever was transpiring here ran far deeper than a single overzealous committee. In that moment, he refrained from further argument, though a part of him yearned to. He considered exiting the truck and walking past the guards on foot, daring them to make good on their threat of arrest, but he understood that expending his anger now would only provide Victoria with a narrative she could later exploit. Thus, he maintained a steady grip on the steering wheel, committed the faces of the two guards to memory, noted the make of Victoria's sedan, and slowly backed down the road he had traveled his entire life, sifting through his recollections for the old logging trail his father had shown him years ago. This clandestine route skirted the eastern tree line, emerging near the barn without ever approaching the gate the association claimed dominion over. The trail proved more rugged than he remembered, in places overgrown with dense brush, but the truck navigated it successfully, and Ethan found a peculiar, albeit bitter, solace in the fact that even after 12 years away, his body still retained a more intimate knowledge of this land than any stranger wielding a laminated list. He bypassed the farmhouse, heading directly for the hospital, carrying with him the escalating certainty that the situation transcended a mere overzealous committee, and that his father, despite his weakened state, had likely been engaged in this solitary struggle for a considerable time, longer than anyone in the family had realized. The hospital's atmosphere was a familiar blend of antiseptic overlaid with a subtler, warmer human scent. Ethan found his father propped up in a narrow bed, intravenous lines affixed to the back of one hand, appearing diminished from Ethan's last recollection. Richard Carter had always been a robust, weathered man, the sort whose handshake left a lasting impression. But illness had whittled him down, and for a moment, Ethan simply stood in the doorway, absorbing the sight. Richard's eyes brightened upon seeing his son, and his first query was whether Ethan had passed the gate without incident. This question conveyed everything Ethan needed to know. He pulled a chair close to the bedside and recounted the events precisely, observing his father's expression more from bewilderment to disbelief, then to a slow, smoldering anger that the attending physicians would later caution against for cardiac health reasons. Richard explained that the Homeowners Association had been established only a few years prior, ostensibly to manage shared roadways and uphold community standards among the newer developments encroaching upon the old farmland's periphery. Victoria Hale had been its inaugural president from the outset, and from the beginning, she had made it clear that she viewed the Carter farm as an impediment to her vision of a cohesive, regulated neighborhood. Richard detailed the ensuing campaign, months and then years of manufactured complaints arriving like clockwork. Fines were levied for the fence line, which had remained unchanged since 1960. Fines for the tractor parked within view of the road, fines for the cattle shed, the grain silo, and a mailbox post his own grandfather had constructed. Each notice cited a provision within the association's bylaws, and each time Richard had refused to comply, believing, as far as he understood, that no Carter had ever formally agreed to join Victoria Hale's association. He reached beneath his hospital blanket, producing a small brass key, and pressed it into Ethan's palm with fingers that trembled slightly from medication. He directed his son to the safe in the study and revealed its contents. Not only the deed, but also decades of documentation, tax records, a handwritten will, an ancient survey map creased so often its folds had softened like fabric, and a lineage of ownership stretching back 3 generations, each transfer meticulously recorded at the county courthouse. Richard informed Ethan that everything necessary to resolve this matter was contained within that safe, awaiting someone with the fortitude to utilize it. Richard also confessed something he had never divulged in their numerous phone calls over the years. Victoria Hale had personally approached him on multiple occasions, offering what she termed a fair settlement for a portion of the eastern acreage, land the association desired for an expansion of paved roads and shared recreational facilities. Richard had consistently refused, not merely out of obstinacy, but because he grasped the implications of relinquishing even a small parcel of the property, a fissure in a foundation that had remained steadfast for 70 years. He explained that Victoria's demeanor had grown increasingly severe with each refusal, and that the fines began arriving with renewed frequency shortly after his final rejection, as if in retribution for his defiance. He also cautioned his son that Victoria was not one to yield easily, having built her reputation in the county on her ability to organize, control, and enhance every property within her reach, and that a farm predating her association by 70 years represented, in her view, an affront she could not overlook. Richard's voice grew weary as he spoke, the machines beside his bed emitting their rhythmic beeps, and a nurse eventually intervened, reminding them that rest was paramount. Ethan assured his father he would manage everything, and for the first time in a long while, he meant it with absolute conviction, unburdened by the familiar urge to retreat to the life he had established far from this county. Ethan remained with his father until visiting hours concluded, and as he drove toward the old farmhouse under a fully darkened sky, his thoughts turned not to anger, but to inheritance, contemplating what it meant to carry forward something established before his very existence. The following morning, Daniel Ross arrived at the farmhouse, bearing a leather satchel that appeared older than much of the furniture within. He had served as the Carter family's legal counsel for nearly 30 years, a man of quiet demeanor and sharp intellect, who had drafted Richard's will and handled every minor legal matter the farm had ever entailed. He meticulously arranged the safe's contents across the kitchen table. As he examined each document, his expression evolved from professional interest to a discernible sense of quiet satisfaction. He explained, methodically, the irrefutable evidence presented by the paperwork. The Carter farm had occupied that land for over 70 years, decades before the Homeowners Association was conceived, let alone legally incorporated. No Carter across 3 generations of ownership had ever signed a covenant agreeing to join the association or abide by its bylaws. The county records clearly indicated the property held an explicit exemption from newer zoning ordinances, specifically due to its status as a pre-existing agricultural estate. Even the access road, the very driveway Victoria's guards had obstructed, was documented as a legal easement predating the association by decades, meaning no board, committee, or self-appointed president possessed any authority to restrict passage. Daniel proceeded further, retrieving a slimmer folder from the bottom of his satchel, which he explained he had compiled over the preceding months after Richard first mentioned the escalating fines during a routine visit to update his will. Within this folder were copies of every notice the association had ever dispatched to the Carter residents, each one cross-referenced against the association's own publicly filed bylaws, and in nearly every instance, the fines cited a rule that either did not exist in the official documents or had never been properly ratified by a board vote. Daniel elucidated that this pattern suggested something more insidious than simple overreach. It indicated Victoria Hale had been fabricating her authority as she went, capitalizing on the likelihood that most residents would prefer to pay a small fine rather than confront her directly. Daniel placed the last document down and regarded Ethan with the faint, dry amusement of a man who had spent his career observing instances of overreach. He stated plainly that Victoria Hale and her association's actions constituted trespassing on private property and interference with lawful access, and that, in his professional opinion, they had exposed themselves to significant legal liability the moment they blocked that gate. He recommended initiating a lawsuit immediately, thereby concluding the matter before it escalated further. Ethan contemplated this for a long moment, turning the ancient survey map in his hands, feeling the brittle paper crackle beneath his fingers. He informed Daniel that he did not wish to initiate the offensive. He wanted Victoria to persist in her actions, to continue believing she held absolute power, because a woman so convinced of her own authority would inevitably commit a transgression too significant to rationalize. Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, recognizing the same patient, strategic temperament that had rendered Richard Carter such a formidable farmer for 4 decades. Victoria did not disappoint him. Within a week, her retaliation had escalated far beyond a single obstructed gate. She ordered the checkpoint reinforced, chains added to the old entrance, and additional guards hired from a private security firm located 2 counties away, men with no prior connection to the Carters and no hesitation in following orders. She prohibited agricultural vehicles from utilizing the access road entirely, forcing farm equipment to remain idle rather than risk confrontation. She extended her actions further, instructing Linda to contact the feed suppliers and equipment vendors who regularly service the farm, implying, without explicit statement, that continued deliveries might incur repercussions from the association. Victoria had forged her identity around the association almost from the moment she relocated to the county, arriving with capital from a prior career in property management and firm convictions that rural communities simply required the correct individual to organize them effectively. She had observed other developments nearby fall under similar associations and, by her own standards, flourish with uniform fencing, matching mailboxes, and predictable property values. She had convinced herself that the scattered independent farms surrounding her development were an unsightly element in need of correction. The Carter farm, sprawling and untouched by her influence, had become for her less a tract of land and more a personal challenge, one she was determined to overcome irrespective of the actual documentation. Some vendors, apprehensive of jeopardizing other contracts within Victoria's expanding sphere of influence, discreetly canceled their deliveries. Others simply ceased responding to calls. Victoria believed, with the same misplaced certainty that had propelled her this far, that isolation would break the Carters, as it had resolved smaller disputes in the past, that a man with an ailing father and a stalled harvest would eventually present himself at her office and sign whatever document she placed before him. Ethan did nothing of the sort. Instead, he began meticulously documenting every event. He installed a small camera near the old barn, another facing the access road, and carried his phone with him at all times, recording every interaction, every threat, every guard who raised a hand or their voice. He maintained a written log with dates and times, cross-referencing each incident with the fabricated notices the Victoria's Association continued to mail to the farmhouse. Where Victoria perceived a weakening adversary, Ethan was quietly assembling a case, accumulating evidence piece by piece with a patience that unnerved even Daniel Ross. He also began discreetly conversing with neighbors, over coffee or across property lines, in the manner that rural communities had always exchanged information long before the advent of what was termed networking. He discovered he was not isolated in his discontent, learning of a widowed woman residing 2 farms away who had incurred almost $400 in penalties over 18 months for a garden shed erected decades prior to the association's establishment. Furthermore, a young couple renting a small plot near the county road had faced threats of legal repercussions for refusing to repaint their mailbox a specific shade of gray mandated by the association as standard. None of these individuals had challenged Victoria's authority in the manner Ethan now intended, largely because they lacked an attorney of Daniel Ross's caliber or the fortitude to engage in a protracted legal struggle. Ethan began meticulously documenting these conversations, not for immediate use, but because he instinctively recognized that his own situation represented merely the visible manifestation of a much larger pattern of overreach, one that had been silently endured for years due to a general unwillingness to confront it directly. The eventual counteraction materialized not through direct confrontation, but through established legal avenues. Daniel submitted a formal complaint to the county court, seeking an emergency injunction against the Homeowners Association, coupled with a claim for damages stemming from the disruption of agricultural activities and the unlawful obstruction of a recorded easement. The filing quickly reached the desk of a county judge within days, and, as per procedure, copies were forwarded to the sheriff's department for review. Sheriff Mason Cole, a veteran of Millbrook County for over 2 decades, possessed a deep understanding of the area and harbored significant skepticism towards an association that had rapidly emerged and begun asserting dominion over properties to which it had no legitimate claim. Upon receiving the complaint, he personally examined the county's land records, tracing the Carter parcel's ownership history through every recorded transfer, rather than relying on second-hand accounts. His findings corroborated Daniel Ross's assertions made at the Carter family's kitchen table. The farm had never, at any point, fallen under the Homeowners Association's jurisdiction. Mason personally visited the association's modest administrative office, documents in hand, and directly requested Victoria to articulate the legal justification for preventing a family from accessing land unequivocally recognized by the county as their own. Instead of backing down, Victoria escalated her stance. Standing defiantly in her doorway, arms crossed, she informed the sheriff, captured on camera and in the presence of 2 board members, that she governed the entirety of that district and that the Carters would be compelled to respect the association's authority. Having grown up in a neighboring township, Sheriff Cole remembered passing the Carter property as a boy on his way to the county fair, and he had known Richard Carter socially for nearly 30 years, sharing the kind of casual familiarity common in smaller counties. He found Victoria's unearned confidence unsettling, stemming as it did from the assumption that most people would comply rather than question. He made a mental note to ensure this dispute was resolved strictly by the book, without bias, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. This was a declaration born of sheer pride, the hallmark of someone unaccustomed to being denied. Sheriff Cole offered no verbal response beyond thanking her for her time, but he ensured his deputy recorded every word. That single statement, delivered with such casual assurance, would later prove more damaging to Victoria's position in court than any legal document Daniel Ross could have presented. Victoria's unchecked confidence rapidly devolved into recklessness. Frustrated by the sheriff's failure to immediately enforce her perceived authority, and increasingly convinced of Ethan's impending capitulation, she made a fateful decision that would ultimately end her tenure as association president. She instructed Linda to replace the locks on the farm's main gate entirely, cutting through the old chain installed by Richard's father decades earlier. She also authorized the use of a small excavator to widen the access point for what she termed necessary community infrastructure. The excavator's bucket violently tore through a section of the original perimeter fence, splintering timber that had stood since the 1950s, timbers that Richard himself had repeatedly repaired by hand. This was, quite literally, an act of destruction against a historic structure maintained by the family for 3 generations. Ethan's security cameras meticulously documented the entire event, the cutting of the chain, the fence collapsing under the excavator's force, and Linda overseeing the operation with the same brisk efficiency she had employed to block Ethan's truck weeks before. Linda herself experienced her first significant moment of doubt that afternoon, witnessing the ancient timber shatter and fall. Though she remained silent, continuing to direct the crew as ordered, the sound of the fence breaking, akin to a bone snapping, lodged itself uncomfortably in her memory. She would recall that sound frequently in the ensuing weeks, long after the cameras had captured all that Daniel Ross required. Upon reviewing the footage that evening, Daniel Ross slowly set down his coffee, allowing himself a subtle, grim smile. He informed Ethan that any ambiguity surrounding the civil dispute had evaporated. The physical destruction of private property and the forceful breach of a boundary predating their organization was no longer a matter for polite legal discourse. It had become a criminal act. Sheriff Mason Cole initiated a formal investigation the following morning, focusing on 3 distinct charges confirmed by the county attorney, as well supported by Ethan's gathered evidence. Trespassing on private agricultural land without legal authorization, willful destruction of property, specifically the historic fence line and original gate mechanism, and interference with a property owner's legal right of access, a charge carrying significant weight given the documented pattern of obstructed deliveries and threatened vendors stretching back weeks. For the first time since the ordeal began, Victoria Hale found herself on the receiving end of official notices. The court hearing was scheduled for the following month, and news of it spread through Millbrook County with the characteristic quiet rapidity of small communities. Victoria appeared dressed in a sharply tailored gray suit, clutching a thick binder filled with association bylaws, meeting minutes documenting board votes, and copies of every fine notice sent to the Carter farmhouse, as if sheer volume of documentation could compensate for legal standing. Flanked by 2 board members, she initially appeared confident as she organized her materials with practiced efficiency, seemingly believing the outcome would favor her. Ethan sat beside his father in the gallery. Richard, despite the doctor's reservations about the outing, insisted on attending, clad in his best jacket. Sheriff Mason Cole occupied a few rows back, arms crossed, observing the proceedings with the quiet intensity of a man who had already thoroughly investigated the matter and merely awaited confirmation. The courtroom gradually filled with familiar faces, neighbors drawn by the whispers of the dispute to witness its resolution. Several exchanged knowing glances, suggesting they too harbored their own unresolved grievances with the association. Daniel Ross, in contrast, presented far less paper but conveyed considerably more legal weight. He produced the original 1952 survey map, brittle and carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. He presented the recorded deed, tracing unbroken ownership through 3 transfers, grandfather to father to the current generation. He submitted county tax records confirming continuous Carter ownership without interruption or dispute. He laid out Richard's notarized and unambiguous will. Finally, he presented the documented easement establishing the access road as a legal rite of passage, which no subsequent organization could unilaterally revoke. The judge, a measured woman who had clearly conducted her own thorough preparation, turned her attention to Victoria and posed a single, direct question. On what legal authority had the association claimed jurisdiction over the Carter property? Victoria opened her binder, browsed through pages of bylaws and internal resolutions, and began speaking about community standards, neighborhood cohesion, and the board's unanimous vote. The judge waited patiently but resolutely, reiterating her request for the specific document confirming the Carter Farms membership within the association. There was no signature to produce. None had ever existed. The ensuing silence stretched uncomfortably, becoming its own answer. Board members shifted in their seats. Linda, seated towards the rear, stared at her hands. Victoria attempted to speak again, referencing implied consent through proximity to association-managed roads, but her argument faltered when Daniel Ross calmly reminded the court that the access road in question was itself an easement recorded before the association's inception, thus granting the Carters rights, not obligations, especially not to Victoria's board. The ruling, when it came, was comprehensive and irrefutable. The court determined that the Homeowners Association held no legal authority whatsoever over the Carter property, rendering every fine levied against the family in prior years void from its inception. Furthermore, Ethan Carter, as the designated heir under his father's recorded will, held full and legitimate standing as co-owner of the land alongside his father. The judge also concluded that Victoria Hale had knowingly exceeded any reasonable interpretation of her authority, citing the destruction of the fence line and her own recorded statement claiming dominion over the entire district as evidence of deliberate overreach rather than honest miscalculation. Addressing the broader pattern presented by Daniel Ross late in the proceedings, the judge reviewed the compilation of questionable fines and fabricated bylaw citations, remarking from the bench that such a consistent pattern raised serious concerns about the association's good faith dealings with all its members, not solely the Carter family. She mandated a full accounting of all fines collected over the preceding 3 years for review by the county attorney's office, making it clear that this ruling, while specific to the Carter property, would likely be the inaugural chapter in a far more extensive reckoning for Victoria Hale and her organization. Sheriff Mason Cole acted swiftly once the ruling was finalized, dispatching deputies to the Carter farm that same afternoon with instructions to oversee the removal of all barriers erected by the association. Guards who had previously stood with arms crossed at the gate now dismantled the checkpoint under supervision, hauling away chains and temporary fencing as neighbors who had gathered along the road watched in stunned disbelief. Linda Brooks, standing near her vehicle as the last barricades were removed, began to weep, less from sympathy for the family she had helped obstruct than from the sudden, profound realization of her complicity. Victoria stood apart, motionless, her carefully constructed authority dissolving in real time before the very community she claimed to protect. The aftermath of her legal defeat proved almost as damaging as the ruling itself. Once news of the blocked gate and the destroyed fence circulated through Millbrook County, other residents began coming forward with their own unresolved issues. Families who had quietly paid fines for fences, sheds, and mailboxes over the years, never truly questioning the association's claimed authority, suddenly found the courage to ask the same question Ethan had posed at that initial checkpoint. On what legal basis? Several residents contacted Daniel Ross directly, presenting their own stacks of disputed notices. Within weeks, a pattern emerged that cast Victoria's leadership in a far less favorable light than she could have ever imagined. Fines were issued without proper board authorization. Fees were collected and never accounted for in any public record, and threats were made to vendors and contractors serving properties the association had never legitimately governed. The county attorney's office launched a broader inquiry into the association's financial practices, revealing that the Carter Farm incident was not an isolated overreach, but rather the case where Victoria had finally encountered a family possessing the resources, documentation, and patience to resist. Richard Carter was discharged from the hospital on a cool, bright morning approximately 2 weeks after the ruling. His color had returned, his heart rate stabilized, and his disposition had softened somewhat from rest and the news his son had shared nightly. Ethan drove him home along familiar back roads, passing fields that had turned golden and brown with the changing season. As the truck rounded the final bend towards the farmhouse, the gate stood open, just as it always had before Victoria Hale's interference. No guards were present, no laminated lists, no chains. A profound sense of peace settled between father and son, and the land that had nurtured them both. Richard requested Ethan stop the truck a short distance before the gate, and the two men sat in silence for a moment, gazing at the old farmhouse, the barn roof patched with tin, the pasture stretching towards the tree line, precisely as it had for 70 years. Richard then nodded, and Ethan drove them through. Victoria Hale's legal difficulties extended beyond the civil judgment. In the subsequent months, she faced a separate lawsuit specifically addressing the destruction of the fence and the widespread pattern of unauthorized fines, a case pursued by Daniel Ross not out of spite, but from a steadfast belief in the importance of accountability. She was removed from her position as association president by a nearly unanimous board vote following the revelation of financial irregularities. County investigators continued to scrutinize years of collected fees that had never been properly documented or accounted for. The woman who had once stood in a doorway and declared dominion over an entire district found herself, by the following spring, controlling nothing at all. Ethan did not truly celebrate his victory. There were no gatherings, no toasts, no triumphant procession through the gate for lingering cameras that occasionally still documented the story beyond the county lines. Instead, on the first genuinely cold morning of the new season, he donned his father's old work gloves and walked to the section of fence line damaged by the excavator. There, board by board, he began to meticulously rebuild it, using the same joint style his grandfather had employed, a skill passed down through Richard's patient tutelage. He spent the following weeks engaged in similar, quiet, unglamorous tasks. He replanted a row of young oak trees along the driveway where his father had originally planted them decades earlier. Trees Richard had always intended to see mature, but had never gotten around to replacing after a storm felled the originals. He undertook the proper repair of the barn roof, eschewing mere patching. He walked the fence lines with his father in the slanting afternoon light, their conversation sparse, as little needed to be said. Word of the events at the Carter farm continued to spread long after the court proceedings concluded, primarily carried by neighbors who had come forward with their own experiences once Victoria's authority crumbled. Daniel Ross found himself fielding calls from families across 3 counties, individuals who had spent years quietly paying fines they never believed were legitimate, simply because challenging an organization that spoke with such practiced certainty always seemed more trouble than it was worth. Ethan never sought the limelight, but he answered truthfully whenever asked how it had begun, always returning to the same simple truth, that the first and only thing he had ever requested of Victoria Hale was proof. Ethan also made a point of visiting the widowed neighbor 2 farms over, the one who had paid nearly $400 in fines for a garden shed built decades before the association's existence. He sat with her at her kitchen table while Daniel explained, in straightforward terms, how she could reclaim what was rightfully hers. She wept a little, not from sorrow, but from the profound relief of being believed after years of assuming no one would ever bother to verify her claims. In moments like these, Ethan discovered a sense of purpose he hadn't anticipated on a homecoming that had begun with a blocked gate and a laminated notice. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the western pasture, casting the entire farm in hues of amber and rust, Richard stood beside his son near the newly repaired gate and spoke words that would ultimately define the essence of their struggle more profoundly than any court ruling. He stated that the land was never merely property, never just lines on a survey map or names recorded at a courthouse. He explained that it represented a promise, passed quietly from one generation to the next, a commitment renewed each time someone chose to remain, to rebuild, to respond when called in the dead of night. He told Ethan that what they had protected was not the soil itself, but the enduring promise the family had upheld across 3 generations, a promise that no organization, however confident, well-funded, or self-assured of its authority, could simply erase on a piece of letterhead. The camera, had it been present to capture that final moment, would have slowly panned back across the darkening fields, past the mended fence and the slender, hopeful young trees standing against the approaching winter, past the old farmhouse with its illuminated windows, until the entire scene diminished into the vast, quiet expanse of Millbrook County under a deepening autumn sky. No guards remained at the gate. There was no checkpoint, no laminated list, no woman in a tailored suit asserting dominion over land she had never owned. There was only a father and a son standing together on ground that had outlasted every attempt to dispossess them, undeniable proof that no institution, however powerful it perceived itself to be, could obliterate a legacy still safeguarded by truth.